Grab your pitchforks and rotten fruit. You're entering the show that encourages dangerous discussions with God's holy book. I'm your host, Ryan White, and this is Conversations with the Bible. This week we're doing kind of a bonus episode. I already did an episode on the Book of Esther and Purim and everything associated with that with Rico Cortez, but I wanted to, in line with how the show is working out, bring on a different perspective. So I brought my good friend Matthew Vander Els on, and we discussed it from a different perspective. We brought up some different things, and it turned out into just an incredible discussion. I really enjoyed it. I really hope you do. This is with myself and Matthew Vander Els of Founded in Truth Ministries. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Conversations with the Bible podcast. I'm on with Matthew Vander Els. Say hi, Matthew.
Hey, everybody. This is Matthew Vander Els.
Hey, thanks for being on with us, man. This is our second episode that we're doing here, and I've already had fun, and I know this one's going to be great. I wanted to stop for a second and bring a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored, believe it or not, by Nimrod's wife. She's trying to clear her name. She's been accused often of being named Semiramis or Ishtar, and that's just not the case. And so she wanted to bring this sponsored message and let everyone know that her name is actually Susan. So thank you, everyone out there, for listening to that message.
Thank you, Susan, for making this podcast happen. This is great. I'm honored to be on here, and so thank you for our sponsors. Absolutely.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about the Book of Esther, and surprisingly, Esther comes from the word Ishtar.
No!
It would be crazy to have a pagan name in the Bible, I know, but based on our research, it actually does come from the name Esther. So how do you feel about that, Matthew, reading a book that has the name of a pagan goddess?
Well, I'm glad you asked. When we first enter the Book of Esther, we need to take off our lenses that we often wear when we read the Bible. It's kind of like when we read the Bible, when we read Jonah. We don't expect like a book that's a comedy parable narrative when we read it. We're reading it like the serious book, and it is serious, but we have to let the authors tell us why they do things, and let the authors of each individual book in this library we call the Bible determine how we're supposed to read it. And so when we start in the Book of Esther and we start reading the Book of Esther, we find out that there's this Jewish girl named Hadassah. No, Mordecai did not change her name to Esther, so she would hide herself. It says her name was Hadassah and Esther. That is Esther. That was her name. She had two names, but that was one of them. And as we read the story, I think that builds the context for why the author chose that name for her, or why that was her name. Same thing with Mordecai. More commentaries put a lot more emphasis on Mordecai coming from Marduk. Dun, dun, dun.
Uh-oh.
The man of Marduk, I think, is Mordecai, something like that.
The man of Marduk.
I mean, good gracious. And so, when we're hit with that, if you're sensitive, I know we have a lot of pagan snowflakes out there that are just really sensitive and offended by anything that is remotely quote unquote pagan. Yeah. This is not the book for you at all.
Definitely not.
But I think, the story starts off with a pagan king. And we don't even hear about what Mordecai and Esther till the second chapter, that's into true. The second chapter.
Yeah. And
when we hear about them, these are not like the two Jews that worship God, or the two Jews that defied the pagan Persian Empire, or the two Jews that were loyal only to God, or the two Jews that prayed towards Jerusalem, or the two Jews that kept the Torah. No, none of these things are used to describe them. These two Jews lived in Susa or Shushan, Persia. So they went to Babylon. It tells us they went to Babylon. along
Yeah.
with their families, went to Babylon, and then they or their families didn't move towards Israel. They moved farther away from Jerusalem into modern day Iran area. And
Yeah.
so this is a book. This is a book about two Jews who have assimilated into secular culture.
Yeah.
And
And we gotta also remember that this is after the decree from Cyrus that they can go home.
oh yeah, this is what, 2 generations after,
Yeah.
2 kings after. I mean, yeah, it's been a while. And so this is so. You asked me how I feel about her name being Ishtar. Seems completely normal to me.
Yeah.
I was reading a blog about a Jewish guy, and his parents were conservative growing up, but because of the place they lived in the U.S. and the time period they lived in, when he was born, he ended up being named Christopher.
Nice.
It is what it is. Yeah, it is what it is. And he had a commentary on Esther that was fascinating. So
That's interesting because I mean I wonder if his parents, when they're naming him, if they even really kind of realize the irony there. Because a lot of people, realistically, I didn't realize that Christopher came from Christ until a couple of years ago, honestly, because I never even considered it. So
absolutely, it's what you do when you're in a culture. And Mordecai doesn't even have a Hebrew name in the Book of Esther. And so we have, Man of Mordecai and Ishtar. And we know at least we have many Persian documents that Mordecai was a very common name, and assumingly so Ishtar was as well. I mean, these were common names.
Yeah.
So these were Jews who had very secular names because they were assimilated in a secular culture. Thus, we are introduced to the story of Esther.
Well, and I think that the names are very fitting because we don't really see devotion to God anywhere. There's no mention of God. To my knowledge, there really is just one little part that even kind of possibly hints at God, and that's where Mordecai tells Esther, if you don't do it, help's going to come from somewhere else.
Sure.
So
that's about it. And like you could assert some religious ties to when she asked people to fast for her, but not because they were fasting, just the clause in there like, for me, like I'm about to go before the king, so I need, as if she needs some type of spiritual emotional support. But yeah, the book seems to be, was an author recently that wrote a book that he made the assertion that if it wasn't in the Bible, we could read it as a completely secular story.
Yeah,
and
that's very true. I was going to say the only reason why we know that fasting is a religious thing to do is because that's, elsewhere that's what people do.
Sure. So, yeah.
So when I read this, I mean, I felt that because of how much, assimilation we see and just all this stuff, that it really kind of speaks to us today, because we live in a world where, I mean, there's people even today that our good friend Dina Dye.
Yeah.
Her name is, she went by Diane. All right.
Yeah.
I can't remember the whole story. It was either her birthday I think it was Diane, and then she changed it to Diana, and then she realized that was.
That's right, and she wanted to be
people
called
emailing
Dina,
her, that hey, your name's pagan, so she ends up changing it to Dina in order to do that, and so that's a story that each one of us connect with because we probably know people that have names that in hindsight you're like, oh, well, that's kind of connected to this, that, or the other.
Sure. So yeah, it's fascinating. When I was looking up the Christian acceptance and Christian history of Esther, I didn't realize that there was the early church wasn't a big fan. Apparently, there were too many commentaries within the first 6 or 7 centuries of the early church. From my understanding, I think Karen Jobes makes that comment. She does a big commentary on Esther, and I know that John Calvin never preached on Esther in any of his sermons, and Martin Luther, I think, had actually was a little outspoken about how he just didn't like the book. If he had his choice, he'd take it out of the Bible. He just wasn't comfortable with it because, in the let's see here, in the Christian Canaan, and Esther falls beside Ezra and Nehemiah, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Now that you asked me, I don't know, but
yeah. So you have Ezra and Nehemiah, like the Jews that went back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple, and they're telling all of the Judeans, listen, you need to divorce your wives because this is against God, this is against Torah. We have the Torah scroll here. It's time to get right with God. And then we go straight into a story about a young teenage girl who goes and trains for a year to have a sexual experience with a pagan king, and to actually compete one night with him to become queen. And in the Jewish Canaan, Esther falls beside Daniel, if I'm not mistaken, which makes for a very uncomfortable contrast, because Daniel's here, I'm not even going to bow to this statue. I'm not even going to eat the king's food. And Esther just bebopping around in the harem. They're feeding her dietary food, I'm assuming for her beauty and weight loss or whatever. Who knows what they were doing for a year.
Well, and the fact that she's having to hide that she's a Jew would mean she can't say no to, lobster or pork or whatever else the king has.
Yeah, there's no indication whatsoever that she was, had this, we go to restaurants and they accidentally put pork or shrimp on our plate or whatnot, and we'd be, I'm sorry, I can't, even if it was our fault, like we didn't read it in the menu, I'll buy it, she was, okay. Yeah. It's a very daunting story to read next to those books, and it definitely messes with you when you look at it from the author's point of view and what he actually writes. It's a fun book to read.
I like that too, that you bring up what books it's next to, because I really honestly don't think that a lot of people realize the irony of where it's placed.
Oh yeah.
Because we tend to, I'm going to read Esther today, so you flip to the chapter of Esther and you don't happen to look and see, what's around it. And yeah, I mean, Nehemiah and Ezra are like, they're just, covenant and get rid of your pagan wives. This is the stuff that got us into trouble. And Esther's like, let's party while we're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, drinking parties are a main theme through this book, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I was reading through this earlier, and I didn't even realize that when Esther holds the banquet, it's not like they show up and they have, like their hors d'oeuvres, and she's like, hey, by the way, king, this guy next to me is trying to kill me. It says that the second day of her banquet with him. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a full-out party.
It was a full-out party. And from my understanding, I think the Persians really like to drink, especially when big decisions were on the line. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I was talking to Rico about this earlier, and he brought that up. I hadn't heard of that before, but yeah, apparently that was the way to make decisions, was to be drunk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Your inhibitions come. Nothing's stopping you, so that has to be the best decision. I mean,
I'm guessing that's where the Vikings got it from, because if I remember in some of those Viking shows, that was the thing to do, is get plastered.
Make a decision. Sure. But yeah, it is a book. I feel like the book is extremely important, especially when you look at the content of how it applies today. Because, there's actually an argument that it still shouldn't be in our Bible. And there's actually a big push with messianics about how it's pagan because Ishtar and Marduk, and it shouldn't be in our Bible, and Purim is pagan, and everything's pagan, and it's like, can you read the story that God placed in our scripture, like in our Bible? Like, can you read the story? And yes, God is in it. God's providence is in it. The book is not filled with a bunch of coincidences. It's filled with God's providential plan that is played out through imperfect people. And if the author tells us that by introducing the king, and introducing Esther and Mordecai, and these are imperfect people, and we're going to see how God uses imperfect people for His plan, and He is constant. He doesn't change, and I love that in the book, because it's not like she decides to go compete. She doesn't even push back. Neither does Mordecai. He's like, all right, he doesn't. He gets passionate about bowing down to an Agagite, but no, he won't. He won't say a peep when his teenage daughter is going to go in and be in a harem train for a year to have a sexual experience with the king. Not going to say a word. That's cool.
Nice.
That's cool, right?
Yeah.
And so these are imperfect people that God is going to use for His ultimate plan, and I think that's beautiful.
Oh yeah. I mean, that throughout Scripture,
it's a story about us.
Yeah. I mean, how many of us are perfect? No, we oftentimes identify with Abraham or with David, or having done these terrible things, and for the people that want to take it out of the Bible, I'm sorry, but that's just intellectual laziness. I mean, that's saying I can't handle this, so let's just tear it out, rather than trying to wrestle with God. And that's one of the things with this podcast that I'm really trying to introduce, is the idea that the Bible is not the end of the discussion, it's the beginning of the discussion, that we read the text and then we wrestle with it, and that's good. That develops us, and that creates a mature faith rather than an eggshell faith that we see so often, where as soon as you challenge someone's paradigm, the blood raises to their face, and they start accusing you of a heretic, or you're not reading the literal word, or this, that, or the other. And that's toxic to our growth and our maturity as believers, honestly, and to the movement.
Sure. There's a lot of people that want to base their faith on certainty and base their faith on their opinion of God. And God is not bound to our opinions, guys. I'm sorry to break it to you. I have a lot of opinions about God, but none of them are going to change who God is. And I have to be the one to be able to develop and say, okay, this is my opinion, but I could very well be wrong, because I know God is bigger than me. And it's okay to be uncertain about your opinions on certain things, especially when it comes to the Scriptures, because there are so many. The reason why the Bible has been a hot topic of debate for the past 2,000 plus years is because of opinions. It is vague in so many areas, and it is written to be that way. It's written for us to have it on our minds and to discuss and to ground out. What is it? The Jews canonized their arguments about the Scriptures. You know what I'm saying? Like, they understood.
That's really what oral Torah, what Mishnah and Talmud is it's canonizing disagreements and discussions and debates.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I wish I would have been brought up in this mindset that the Bible is like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's provoking us to argue and debate. It's like,
oh yeah.
One of the Psalms I love. I'm gonna have to do a whole show on this sometime. I wrote an article about it, but Psalm 89, right? The psalmist is just pouring out his heart on how wonderful the covenant is and how it's everlasting, and just, I mean, you're just like, you're so like built up, and then he goes, you hit like things like verse 39. He's like, but in reality, God, you've spurned the covenant. You've got rid of your anointed. You're a liar, God. That's what he's saying. He's saying, you're a liar, God.
Yep.
You promised all these things, and we got to realize this psalm is being composed either in the exile or just after the exile, when there's no Davidic king, and it, from their perspective, it looked like God's promises aren't coming true. But I love that right there in Scriptures we see a contradiction between what the reader thought God was saying and what is in reality happening, and that it's okay to wrestle with it, to bring it to God. And by writing it down, he's basically bringing it up to the community, saying, hey guys, I need an answer.
Well, sure, and we see this in Scripture. I mean, I have my issues with books of the Bible too. I'll be honest, I have flesh, Ryan. And like the two books I have issues with are mainly Job and Ecclesiastes, because they depict the character of God as something that I have issues with. And it's my flesh that has issues, because Torah says, Ryan, that if you keep the commandments and you do all these things just right and you turn the right screws, then you will be blessed. And if you don't, you're going to be cursed. Mm-hmm. And then Job comes out of nowhere And his friends, Job's friends, the ones that we always mock and like, oh, these are unwise friends, they're the ones asking Job. They're like, dude, obviously you broke some commandments, because that's who God is. If you break commandments, you're going to be cursed. And if you keep commandments, like, we have this down to a T. We know how to exploit God's grace. We just keep these rules. And Job's like, I haven't done anything. And his friends were technically right, according to one section of Scripture, but they weren't right. And Ecclesiastes, my goodness, oh, it burns me up. When people take chapter 12, it was at 13, 14, here's the conclusion of the whole matter: fear God and keep his commandments. People take this verse and they'll post it on their Facebook page, and they'll be like, this is the whole duty of a man. Look, and they're trying to build up, obedience to God, which is a good thing, but they're taking the verse completely out of context. Did you read the last 12 chapters? Like, this is the conclusion of how life sucks, and how, essentially, you can try to depend on being blessed if you do all these things, but you're probably just going to die a horrible death anyway. And, it's going to rain on both the, you know what I mean? Like, it's not, people are like, my favorite book's Ecclesiastes, and I'm like, you're a morbid person,
Things must be really down in your life then.
Yeah, like, my goodness. But that's my issue, and I have to accept that God is greater than I am, and God's character is not going to be exploited by simply doing rules. Or his desire is that we follow him. His desire is that we obey him, but there is something more that he is yearning for us to give to him. And it's more than simply going through motions. It's our heart, which is the whole story of the Bible. Sorry, that's my rant. I apologize.
I love it, man. It's we all should have parts of Scripture that we don't understand. And
Sure.
what would you think about the idea that those parts of Scripture are probably some of the best stuff for you, because God, we as human beings oftentimes grow the most when things are going bad. Wow. And that maybe God puts, you chose to put stuff in Scripture that for you is like, how do I deal with this? Because he's wanting you to grow.
Absolutely. No, I think that's spot on. Spot on.
So speaking of
what have we done? Where are we going?
No. This, I was going to bring it back to Esther. It's just when you talked about someone kind of taking something out of context, it reminded me of a discussion I had sometime that someone was using they were saying, well, my wife should just wives should always give honor to their husbands. I'm like, okay. So, let's talk about this. And so the person turned to Esther chapter 1, verse 20.
Of all the places to go.
where the king, his edict to be made throughout all the land is that all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. And forgive me for saying this, but this is a pagan king giving an edict. I don't think that is like, hey, believers in God, this is what you should be, this is instructions for your wife. Now, I'm not saying that women should honor their husbands, but this is not where we should turn to.
Totally agree. I hear a lot of commentaries that they try to, just like we try to do with Yeshua's parables, it's allegory and everything has to have a meaning behind it. So the king obviously represents God, and like Vashti is like this disobedient Israel, and Esther is like the church. And I'm like, have you read this book?
Ooh, yeah.
This is a king who is so self-absorbed with himself. He has a 6-month party. As long as everyone comes in, open bar, you get a golden solo cup, and it's a 6-month party of people toasting him. And his vanity of his palace, and he's trying to show off. And then he brings Vashti in, and he's like, I want Vashti to come in here. So he's showing off everything he has to all of his guy friends for 6 months and 7 days. And then finally, while everyone's there, he has one more thing up his sleeve. I want to show off. I want you guys to envy one more thing that I have. I want you to see how hot my wife is. And so he calls his wife in there. Yeah. and she doesn't come. Yeah, that's God. It just, I'm sorry, that was probably raw of me to assert that's not the greatest of all metaphors. But yeah, Vashti's my hero in the story. To be honest, I love her.
Yeah, I mean, she actually stands up for for her own dignity. It was kind of
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of interesting. I really think that the whole story there is actually just making fun of the king, and
Sure.
showing his inability to do anything. Because in verse 8 it says that the drinking was to be done according to the law. There is no compulsion. So
Yep.
a lot of times they were actually required to drink, and here he's saying, you guys can do what you want at my party. And then Queen Vashti basically takes him up on his no compulsion offer
Oh, that's brilliant.
and
That's
refuses to
brilliant.
come. And then to just like cement his just weakness as a king, then he has to like write a law commanding women to honor their husbands.
That's yeah.
I
It's
mean,
rich, and it's supposed to be something that you laugh at. I truly believe that. In this
oh
part,
yeah.
it's supposed to be humorous, um,
Well, it's I
and
mean
it's brilliant.
the whole book is filled with humor. I mean, Mordecai
Humor and irony. Yeah.
or Haman builds a 75-foot gallows, and
What?
I'm sure you've heard this, but for our listeners out there, this wasn't like the Wild West, rope and noose. This was basically a pole with a spike at the top of it, where you'd impale the person on to display their body. So
This is 75 feet.
yeah.
And then I've also heard the assertion that it could have been a crucifix, which I remember when you spoke. Actually, I was studying right behind you about the crucifixion a couple years ago, and the Persians were really the one. We don't know exactly when or what it looked like. It was a crude, but they were the first ones to crudely develop the crucifixion method. Of course, the Romans perfected it, but yeah, you stick a dead body up there 75 feet. That's like blowing up a disobedient officer in your army for falling asleep during one of your meetings, right? With an anti-aircraft gun.
Kim Jong-un is not going to invite you to his country anymore.
Good gracious.
Well, yeah,
But yeah,
and to even think about it, I mean, 75 feet up, you're not even going to be able to see who the person is, probably,
No.
at that point in time. But yeah, well, and kind of with that, I mean, we do know that they, first off, more than likely, Haman was actually dead when they put him on it, because it says that, like, he leaned in, and it says something about, like, his face was covered, which kind of implies that he died. But his sons for sure were dead, because it says that they killed him, and then, like, the next day they went up and hung them.
Which would have carried, dying by impalement wouldn't have been the worst thing in ancient Persia. It would have not being buried. If you don't have a proper burial, that just messes everything up for you in the afterlife and whatnot.
Afterlife,
plus the shame
of
it.
And basically the birds eat your carcass as you're hanging there. Not a very pretty way to go.
Not at all. No.
So.
So he calls Vashti in there to come in there and use her as his little token. Look what I got, vanity, and she has the dignity to stand up for herself. And then he has a law. He asks his young men, "What do I do about it?" He can't even make a decision. That's how he got Haman. That's how he got Haman to make the decision on what should happen to Mordecai through the streets. He just randomly, I don't know what to do. I haven't thanked Mordecai. Who's outside? Haman's outside. Bring him in here. But yeah, the young men, you should have her for disobeying you. You should have a law where she never gets to see you again. That's brilliant. And you're supposed to chuckle, but yeah.
Well, and I mean, the whole book, I mean, this is one of the best examples of how this book is not just trying to like tell us history. It's carefully editing what's going on in order to bring out these, comedy and stuff. I mean, it's like, the fact that Haman, the day that he plots to kill Mordecai, is the exact same time that the king happens to be reading this report, and so I like to think of it as like, whatever history is involved here, that's like the B-roll, and the author comes in, like how they take a Hollywood movie and they edit it, and they just splice scenes together in a special way to tell the story, that if you just watched actual history play out, it wouldn't be as funny, wouldn't be as enticing, you know?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And there's many books of the Bible that where history is on the back burner. It's
Yeah.
asserted, but that's not the point of the story. And that's what makes Esther so beautiful is it wasn't simply some pagan story that emerged from Persia about some Jews, and it was carefully edited for your viewing pleasure.
Yeah. And so, you know, for those out there listening, we're not trying to say the Bible's not history, but what we're saying here is that when we try to just look at it as like it's a camcorder set up to just record history, we're going to miss the point, because it's edited in a way to be edifying, to be, you know, just like Hollywood movies are a lot better than going out and watching like reruns that you shot on your camera. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And that's what, you know, some people will call it, oh, this is conflicting in different accounts of the Bible that do seem historical. That's why is there. What are they trying to portray to the people they were written to?
Yeah,
and that's what we have to understand.
That's been big for me lately, because I'm going through, you know, the gospel cycle, and you know, at the beginning of it, you know, I said I'm going to focus in on Matthew. I don't care what Luke and John and Mark have to say, because their voice is not important at this point in time. Let's let Matthew tell the story. And, you know, when you try to just like mix it all together, then you get these people seeking out the historical Jesus, and they come up with all sorts of absurd ways to try to fit the picture together, and really destroys the story, I feel.
I don't disagree at all. Absolutely. You know, that's why. Without elaborating on that, absolutely, I totally agree.
Well, and I mentioned that because I mean they were doing that all the way back in like the 3rd century, I think, Diatessaron.
Sure.
So it's been going on for a while.
How do we fix these things? They're not meant to be fixed. It's meant to tell a story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that, you know, and so Passover's coming up, right? So I mean that's another thing that you know, one of the big arguments that you always see around Passover time is, well, was the Lord's Supper, was that the Passover meal, or was that the day before Passover? And our answer should be, well, it depends on who you're reading.
No, Ryan. They all have to line up, and we have to have this one singular chronological gospel that just is seamless all the way through, by multiple authors across multiple time periods that didn't really, you know.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, realistically, the Synoptic Gospels, they're presenting it as a Passover meal, but John can't. He's got to selectively edit it because he's presenting Yeshua as the Passover. And so
he is the lamb, you know.
Yeah. So you've got to again, using that word, selectively edit the story so that the camera focus is on Yeshua as the Passover. And it doesn't make it false, it makes it even more true, because that's what that's the truth John's trying to tell us. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a different what's the word I'm looking for?
Viewpoint
or intent. Message
sure,
that they're trying to put across, and you know, and so
everybody who is on rootedintor.com right now and writing in the contact form, just hate words, just chill out. It's okay. You were warned. We're just discussing the reality of the Bible. So
that's why I don't have a contact form.
Oh, that's genius.
No, I actually got to put that in sometime. One of the things I really want to do on this show is have, you know, people write in some questions and stuff, and you know, and do some shows where either I'm answering it or have, you know, you or someone else on here and answer, or and I don't want to say answer the questions, but discuss the questions, because not all questions have answers. I think, you know, sometimes just having a discussion about the question can be a lot more edifying than saying, well, this is what it means, or that's what it means.
Sure. So, I totally agree. So what was your favorite part of Esther?
My favorite part of Esther, you know, I have to say, it's the part about the king writing to that Esther has to obey, or that all the women have to obey him.
Great.
Just
That's so
because it just shows, you know, a lot of times we as males kind of have there's this perspective of how males are supposed to be, of being the head honcho and being the man of the house and so on and so forth. And so as a male, we should all be saying, yeah, tell those women.
Mm-hmm.
But in my own marriage, I've discovered the best way to lead is by example, not by demanding that my wife honor me. If you want your wife to honor you, you got to earn it. Not write a drunken decree and demand that she do that. Otherwise, it's going to be another Vashti or whatever the case will be.
Sure, it's true. The irony. It's one of the first full reversals, or I guess ironic moments that happens, is the king writes a decree that all the women need to submit to their husbands and listen to their husbands, and then Esther wins this competition, and for the rest of the story, she tells him what to do. It's a beautiful thing. That's beautiful.
That's true. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, I mean, he really through the whole thing is basically just listening to the advice of everyone. I can't remember any place in here where he actually comes up with something on his own. Sure.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I didn't realize that until he read the decree from Mordecai, and he was like, "Who's out in the court? Like, who's standing outside? What random stranger is standing outside? Oh, it's Haman. Cool, bring him in here. Haman, what should I do? What should I do to this guy?" It's brilliant.
Nice.
But again, it's made to set up the king for what it is. And the story is not simply a cut and dry story about the hero. The good guys are oppressed, and then they overcome, and then they're the heroes. It's about very imperfect people who are in imperfect situations, and their lives are set up in a very imperfect way, and yet somehow, some way, mercy and grace and spiritual maturity, or at least some kind of maturity. I lean towards spiritual maturity and growth is the conclusion of it. But there's arguments for the reversal of that too. There was I'd never looked at the reversal statement, the decree that Mordecai writes at the end. Mm-hmm. I never realized that it was almost identical to Haman's, and of course that's probably for the reversal aspect. But Mordecai's over here writing about killing women, kids, and everybody, just like Haman was in the position that Haman was in after he took it over.
That's true. Well, and that brings up a kind of interesting contrast too, because Haman is the Agagite, right? Mm-hmm. And Mordecai, it doesn't outright call him this, but if you trace out his lineage, he's a direct descendant of King Saul.
Sure.
And so I went back to the story in 1 Samuel 15, I believe it is. Where this whole thing between Agag and Saul happened, and this is actually where Saul loses the kingdom, because he doesn't kill Agag, and he takes plunder. He takes sheep and stuff, and then when he's confronted on it by Samuel, he's like, "Oh, well, these sheep, I was going to sacrifice them, of course." Right? He's trying to cover his tracks really quick. So now you've got, however many 100 years later, this, the same showdown again between the descendant of Agag and the descendant of Saul. And, this time they actually kill the Agagite, and they don't take the plunder. Did you notice that?
Wow. I did not.
There's 2 times that it mentions the Jews killing the people that rise up against them, and it specifically says that they did not plunder them.
Wow, I totally missed that. That's brilliant. Brilliant.
So, yeah, that was actually one that I caught all on my own without a commentary. I felt so that's great. Awesome. No, but, yeah.
Well, that's another... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done.
I was going to talk about it brings me to the incident is what I've dubbed it.
Mm-hmm.
The incident where everything went to Sheol in a handbasket. The incident when Haman was promoted, and the king decreed that everyone should prostrate and bow down to Haman. And it's such a beautiful story because, for so long we hear the story of Esther, we celebrate Purim, and even when we read it, we never catch, we're like, okay, well, the one person in the whole empire who didn't want to bow down to this Agag, this son of Agag, if you will, is Mordecai. And, I've always taken the stance where Haman was selfish and he wanted everyone to bow down to his greatness. And Mordecai, he was like Daniel, not bowing down to the statue. Like, he was just totally righteous and he wasn't going to bow down. And that's not at all what the cultural context or the actual text says. So much so that I think a Jewish commentary, they had to fabricate the story of Haman carrying an idol around with him to make it so Mordecai wasn't bowing to idolatry. But the text never says that. And that's brilliant. It really brings out a conflict between the two, because and that's the thing Herodotus speaks about in the Persian Empire, how they used to salute each other, and they'd say, like, what is it, that if you were equals, then you'd kiss each other on the mouth, like that was just a common thing. We could do a message on, greet each other with a holy kiss if you wanted to sometime.
You've never greeted me with a holy kiss, by the way.
I have not.
I put on my chapstick and everything, so I mean,
I'm still studying the ancient Near Eastern context and first century anthropology behind that to make sure that that's the right protocol. And in Persia, Herodotus continues. He says, if someone's just a little bit lower to you, like, they can get away with a kiss on the cheek. But if someone is below your rank, if you're a sergeant and a captain walks in the room, you salute, right? But you do it by bowing down and prostrate. Like, that's how they saluted in their culture. And so Mordecai was this guy who hung out at the city gates, which, again, Herodotus talks about, like, we've discovered these city gates. This was the business hub of Persia.
Yeah.
Mordecai was not just sipping lemonade every single day there. He had some type of job, royal decree, something. He was there on business, and he had some type of premium position. I'm asserting that. To assert that he did not want to bow down to Haman because of idolatry is to also assert that he never bowed to the king, and he never saluted anybody in the workplace to get in the position that he was in, which I can't believe that. Of course he would bow down to the king. Of course he had done this all the time. The issue was Haman only. And when everyone presses him, they're like, hey, why won't you bow down to Haman? You know what he says? I'm a Jew. And we always think, oh, he's righteous. No, he's not righteous. There is something about him that he's refusing to bow down to this ancestor of Agag, perhaps. He's refusing. I am a Jew, and he is this lineage, and I'm not going to bow to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard the assertion that it was pride, and I love that. I hate saying that, but I love entertaining that opinion, because what happens? Because he did not salute. He disobeyed the king, and he did not salute this man that he should have saluted, despite his own agenda. That is what set off the genocide for all the Jews.
Yeah. Well,
so if you wanted to, you could say that pride always destroys everyone around you, but that's a whole sermon.
Well, I mean, I would agree with that too, because if you look at the placement, going back up to the end of chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 3, so
sure.
There's a plot to kill the king. It becomes known to Mordecai. He tells Esther. Esther informs the king. It says in Mordecai's name, right?
Yeah.
And then they kill the two people, and it says after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. So it's like Mordecai saves his life, and in return, the king promotes Haman. So there may have been a little bit of pettiness there. It's like, I just saved your life, and now you're going to give him the job that, maybe I wanted, or, whatever the case may be.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful aspect of the story.
Yeah.
Again, imperfect people.
And so, you got several aspects there. Had they actually been faithful to the covenant and gone back to Israel, when King Cyrus opened up the decree. None of them would ever face this. Had Mordecai just, bowed down to him, like you pointed out, there's no reason why he couldn't. And I was reading in this book, it's called Esther and Her Elusive God. And he goes through and he has this huge list. I mean, it takes like a page and a half, I think, of all the places throughout the Hebrew Bible where men of God, Abraham bows to the Hittites, Jacob bows to Esau, Moses bows to Jethro, David bowed to Jonathan. So this idea that you can't bow down to another human being because that's worship and that's wrong is simply not biblical. We see this throughout the Bible of people bowing down to other people, and it's not ever shown in a negative light. Theologically speaking, there's no issue with Mordecai bowing down to Haman unless he's carrying an idol around.
You're right. We got to throw that in there. Had to have been.
That's one of those ways that they try to close the loops, and it's one of the things that does actually bother me sometimes about Jewish interpretation. I know, like, for example, like the book, the so-called Book of Jasher, which was actually written in like 1400 or 1500 A.D. By a Kabbalistic Jew. And the issue that I take with that is that it tries to explain things and it destroys the story.
Absolutely.
Like you're talking about, how you wrestle with the Book of Job. In the Book of Jasher, they try to make it say that Job was one of the people who advised Pharaoh to kill the Egyptian baby boys, or the Israelite boys. And so, the whole book of Job is about him getting what he deserves. And I'm like, that completely destroys the whole point of the book of Job.
That is so genius, though. I mean,
yeah, but I mean, it completely it completely ruins the story because for me, my perspective, how I've read the book of Job is the book of Job is written for people who haven't done anything wrong, and yet they're suffering and they're wrestling with the idea of why does God allow righteous people to suffer sometimes?
Sure.
And when you take that righteousness away from Job, then he's getting what he deserves, and the whole book is pointless,
Yeah, why does my life suck right now? Oh, I must be just a miserable piece of junk, and I'm a heretic, and I'm a sinner, and obviously I've sinned, and I need to go back and repent for this sin. I don't know what I've done. And you're absolutely right.
And
that
sometimes
might not be the case.
Maybe it's because God's placing bets in heaven.
Oh my gosh.
We'll save that for another day.
Hashtag true story. I mean, what do you...
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. And so, Esther, I mean, you read the whole book of Esther, and it's about extremely imperfect people. Their morality comes into question over and over and over again. And it finally ends with neither Mordecai or Esther being these grand heroes. Like, someone was asking me about, dressing up for Purim, which I dress up for Purim. I'm dressing up as we're doing Jurassic Park this year. Ben's going as a dinosaur, and I got like a hat, and Jenny's dressed like, we got this whole thing down.
That's extra.
And people are like, well, yeah, right. And, hashtag cool. Because why? Why are we dressing up? Because I want to teach the children. A fun way at a very young age that, just because you don't recognize God doesn't mean he's not there,
Yeah.
And it's he's there. He is there, even if you don't recognize him. And so at the end of the story, it's not Mordecai or Esther that are these heroes of the story. It's God. And so, that's the thing. Someone was asking, like, I think, we should dress up as like Esther and Mordecai because they were like the moral role models of the story. And I'm like, well, would you dress up as Samson as a role model? Like, I'm like, Wonder Woman and Captain America would probably be better role models than Esther and Mordecai, but they were the stories that they were the people that God chose to use. And you do see a maturity, at least in Esther, you do see a maturity and a growth in Esther. At the beginning of the book, she's this timid, quiet, being told what to do. And after she realizes that she's going to have to grow, she has to mature at this point, she does it, and she gets bold, and she gets wise in how she speaks to the king, and how she very tactfully handles this huge conflict. And it's life. It's about us. It's about the reader. We are the Esthers and the Mordecais. We are imperfect, and God is constant despite that.
Yeah,
he is still there. He is still there despite the static that we cause in our own lives. And so I feel like it's a beautiful book, and I'm gonna enjoy Purim this year. I'm excited about it. So.
That's awesome. I lost my train of thought there, but yeah, Esther. I like it. Esther and Haman, or Esther and Mordecai, never become perfect, but I do agree with you. You see growth in Esther. She's been taught her entire life to hide her identity, and even when her people are going to be killed, she's still hiding her identity.
Mm-hmm.
Until her uncle Mordecai comes to her and says, "You got to make a choice. You got to do something. Because if you don't do something," and he tells her, "If you don't think that you're going to escape this. If you think that you can just keep on doing what you're doing, it's not going to happen." And I think that's something that in all of our lives is going to happen at some point in time. God may let us kind of skate through life unnoticed for a while, but at some point in time in your life, there's going to come that point where it's do or die. It's you need to get up and do something, and whatever that is. I think it's different for each of us, but we've got to step up and expose ourselves to the world and take those chances. And throw it all out there on the line. I mean, she's putting her life on the line,
mm-hmm.
And so you
see
that growth there.
Yeah, when she finally told the king, about her people and to save my people, oh, my king, oh, if I have found favor in your eyes, please, don't let me and my people be murdered. And I'm sorry to bother you with this. If we were just going to be sold into slavery, I would have never bothered you at all. But this is kind of a big deal. Dude, yeah. She's so wise. And we learned something with that on how how she respected him, even though he was an unrespectable person.
Yeah.
It teaches us a lesson about conflict and how respect diminishes offense. You can destroy offense and focus on an issue instead of yourself or your own emotions or someone else's emotions when you enter a conflict with respect.
Awesome.
But yeah, it was awesome.
She could have just been like, you're such a weak king. Look what you've done. Look what you're doing to me, and tried to play the guilt factor on him and make him feel bad about himself. But no, she comes to him in complete respect, and and even butters them up with some feasting and stuff. I wish my wife, when she wanted something, would throw me a couple banquets. That'd be awesome.
I know, right? That's what I spoke when I did the message at the fellowship the other day. I was like, husbands, what would you do if your wife came to you like that? Oh, my king, if I have found favor in anything, but up to half, I mean, what do you want? But it's true. It's true. There's so many different lessons in the book. And as when we started the podcast, if you're wearing the wrong lenses when you start reading the book, you're going to miss so much of this beautiful piece of literature that I believe God has put into our midst. And so
I know. I will tell you, I mean, I'll be honest, the first couple times after I became a teacher and I was trying to teach on this, my whole objective was to try to prove that this was a historical account. That was all I focused on. And realistically, we got nothing out of it.
It was a big undertaking, though.
I convinced myself it was historical. Maybe I convinced some other people it was historical. But
sure,
that didn't change anything. People who thought it was not historical still thought it was not historical. It didn't matter. And we missed the beauty on this. So yeah, awesome. Well, we're gonna close up here, man. Thank you so much for being on. Let me give you a minute to explain a little bit about how everyone needs to check out your website and your ministry, man.
Oh, well, it's great to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me. And ministry's called Founded in Truth. We're foundedintruth.com, have a lot of online teachings, and we're also a fellowship. That's our main focus, is having a community of believers, like-minded believers in Fort Mill, South Carolina, so right below Charlotte. So if you're ever in the area, swing on by. And we also have a live stream service every single week. So remember, here's our slogan. You ready for it? It's cheesy. Stay fit. Stay founded in truth.
I could use a little bit of fitness myself, I think. And what's the website address so that people can go to your comment box or whatever, your contact box? And
Sure, yeah, our contact form, it's foundedintruth.com. Come on.
Awesome.
So,
well, thanks again for being with us, man.
Absolutely, thank you, and looking forward to talking to you later about more about this. This is a great topic, and I encourage everyone, reread the story. It's brilliant.
Absolutely. Shalom, everyone.